Hi everybody. We're going to conclude our course with a continuation of our discussion on globalization. And we're going to talk about a strange and interesting new phenomenon on the political scene, the European Union. So this is going to be a really brief lecture, as you're going to spend most of your time on this course this week with the teams at Planet Money and This American Life. They'll tell you the story of the EU and the current problems it's facing, and I think they just do a really great job of giving you the history and the current context in a really interesting and funny way. So make sure to check out the weekly overview for the links to those podcasts, as they're really important. The majority of the quiz and the exam material from this week is going to come directly from those. So consult your weekly overview as always. Here in this lecture, I just want to make sure we have a basic understanding of what the European Union is, and then to think about the European Union in terms of why it might be so interesting from the perspective of comparative politics. So how does the European Union make a difference for states and their citizens? Here we'll be talking mainly about the European Union's implications for state sovereignty and the quality of democracy. So what is the European Union, or the EU as it is often called? By some views, the EU is nothing more than a failed experiment that is impeding member states' ability to govern themselves and unfairly limiting their sovereignty. For others, it is the noblest of causes and the first step to a real United States of Europe. It is unlike any form of political organization that we have ever seen, so it'll be fascinating to see whether this organization will constitute a permanent new type of political organization and sovereignty. So what is it exactly? Well, the EU is an enormous supranational political organization. Supranational means above the state, so above state boundaries, or consisting of many states. So it's a combination of states. Indeed, now there are 27 sovereign states that are part of the European Union. These 27 member states collectively make up the world's largest economy and govern over 500 million people. Each of the member states has given a great chunk of its sovereignty to the European Union, and they have agreed to a very extensive group of political and economic EU laws. And EU citizens are living under a number of laws that were made at that EU level and not by their actual state government. The EU bureaucratic apparatus is enormous and complex and handles virtually every imaginable issue. Here's a look at the EU organization, as well as the many different organizations that the EU overlaps with or that are part of the EU. So these flags represent all of the states in Europe, and you can see that not all of them are in the EU. For instance, over here on the left we have Switzerland, which is surrounded by EU members on every side, but is still not part of it. And up here we have states like Ukraine and Albania, states that are not yet member states, but that might be in the future. You can see that these states are part of organizations within Europe, but not the European Union itself. Now here in the middle, you've got the 27 member states of the European Union. And these are part of that strong political and economic supranational governmental organization. Within the EU, there is something called the Eurozone. These states right here in that green circle. The Eurozone includes all of the countries on the EU's currency, or the euro. You can see that not all of the countries in the EU use the euro. So for example, the United Kingdom is a notable exception. They don't use the euro, they stuck with the British pound, which means when you talk about the Eurozone crisis, we're at least not talking about their economies directly. Of course, their economies are connected, being part of the European Union. But the Eurozone crisis is a crisis about the member states of the Eurozone. At any rate, another important part of the European Union is the Schengen Area. And you can see these are the states that are in the Schengen Area. And what that is a common border area. So you'll remember from our last lecture that this is a major example of political globalization, as within the Schengen area, the borders between sovereign states are more like the borders between two United States states. So you can pass from Austria to Germany, just like you might pass from Michigan to Ohio. Indeed, you can now drive all the way from Spain through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, all the way to Poland without hitting an actual border station. This is fascinating from the perspective of the sovereign state, because having absolute control over the state territory is critical to state sovereignty. So control over borders is a huge part of that. The states in the Schengen area have given their border control over to the government of the EU, which is a pretty interesting new development in the history of the development of the sovereign state. Interestingly, not all of the states in the Schengen area are even in the European Union. Indeed, Again, Switzerland is an interesting example. It's not actually an EU member, but you can drive right through it on your EU road trip without hitting a border station, just like you can with other Schengen member states. So you can see that the European Union is a complex organization. So who is in control? Though the bureaucracies of the EU exercise a great deal of control in their own right, the European Parliament is at the top of the EU. They are an elected body leading the EU. Each state sends a number of representatives to the European Parliament to be their voice at the EU level, depending upon how large that member state is. So Germany sends the most representatives to the European Parliament, or EP, because it has the largest population in the EU. Just like California sends the most representatives to the US Congress because it has the largest population within the states. The European Parliament is meant to introduce some democracy to the EU, but because these elections are typically not taken as seriously as national level elections, as people often feel that these EU level elections are too detached from their actual day-to-day lives, and because that body has pretty limited powers in actuality, it is kind of unclear how much accountability these elections really provide. So that brings us to thinking about whether the EU is a success, and here it's a real mixed bag. The EU has certainly been a force for democratic governance and human rights, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the reward of possible EU membership really helped a lot of post-communist states democratize at a surprising pace. Many member states likely benefit from the economic integration, which can help cause investment and growth. At least, this was looking more and more true until the Great Recession and the Eurozone crisis, when this integration cut the other way and allowed for extremely rapid contagion and economic problems, as you'll hear about at length in the This American Life piece. The EU is also an opportunity for small European nations to be part of a major presence on the world scene. Remember, taken together, the EU represents the world's largest economy and has a very significant military presence as well, which helps make it another major power on the world scene to counterbalance the United States and China. Finally, the European Union is predicated on very admirable goals of peaceful, democratic coexistence, and it is meant to prevent the dramatic and tragic conflict Europe has played host to for so many centuries. In that respect, it's a pretty amazing success. Leaders of Europe, particularly those in France and Germany, consciously moved towards European integration following World War II because they wanted to avoid another huge world war. Europe has historically been a very violent place, and it really isn't violent compared to its history now. So this is an example of the success of the European Union, and it's no small feat. Of course, there are many problems. As we see with the current economic crisis, the economic integration has been far from perfect, and we'll hear a lot more about the details and history of that in the podcasts. This flawed integration has been dangerous because of how it opens up the possibility for contagion to spread quickly. The EU is also a threat to sovereignty, putting constraints upon what states can do. Indeed, in times of political and economic crisis, some member states find their hands bound by EU rules and regulations which do not allow them to take the necessary actions. Many saw this as a problem across southern Europe, so like Greece, Spain, and Portugal, during the debt crisis, when these states were tied to a central currency and thus could not resort to the monetary policy to manipulate their own currency to lessen the crisis. So typically what happens when states are faced with an issue like this is that they're able to manipulate their currency to make the crisis less severe. But Greece doesn't have its own currency. It has a currency that's controlled by the European Central Bank. So this constraint can arguably be very difficult and a real threat to sovereignty and prosperity in these countries. This idea of constraint brings us to the chief criticism of the EU, the democratic deficit. With so many important laws being made at the EU level and the elections for the European Parliament being of very limited practical use, EU citizens effectively have little to no say in a number of key policy areas and lawmaking areas that have real effects on their lives. So this is clearly a problem for the standpoint of democratic accountability. So let's just go back here and try and remember what exactly is this democratic deficit. You'll remember that the democratic deficit is the problem that a supranational actor or supranational actors can control state leaders, taking that control out of the hands of the people, which is what is required by democracy. Even though the European Union does have the European Parliament, the elections for the European Parliament don't really seem to form a mechanism of accountability in the European Union yet. especially because the European Parliament's actual powers are quite limited compared to the vast bureaucracies that govern a lot of what the EU does. To succeed, this fascinating new political organization will need to work out just how to preserve democratic accountability and provide the roles of the state on a larger scale. And really, this is one instance where we are lucky to get to see major world history unraveling right before our own eyes. On that note, we will conclude. As this is our last lecture, let me just thank you for being a really wonderful class and a pleasure to work with. I've really enjoyed discussing these issues with many of you, and I hope that you found the course interesting and illuminating. Good luck with finals, and have a great break.